night of the unexpected meeting. The rain had ended just an hour before midnight, leaving the streets of Manhattan glazed with silver reflections. The city pulsed as if it were alive, every window glowing like a restless heartbeat. Cars whispered across wet asphalt, and high above them, at the very edge of the skyline, stood the Orion Hotel, glass, marble, and power stacked into 50 stories. Tonight it hosted the annual Hearts of New York charity gala, a gathering of politicians, tycoons, and the kind of socialites who measured kindness by how much attention their donations bought. Cameras flashed, laughter echoed, and the orchestra's rhythm tangled with the sound of ambition. In the middle of it all, Luca Moretti stood like a shadow carved out of light. Black suit, silver cufflinks, and the kind of composure that made men lower their voices and women hold their breath. To the city he was a myth wrapped in flesh, the man who rebuilt an empire out of fear and flawless control. He had money that could bend laws, influence that could silence enemies, and the calm of a storm that never announced itself. Every movement he made felt deliberate, like he was conducting an orchestra only he could hear. Yet behind that calm mask a certain emptiness lingered, the kind that no amount of gold or power could ever fill. He had come to the gala not for charity, but for leverage. Politicians owed him, bankers feared him, and rivals imitated him. His presence alone was a reminder that while others wore crowns of reputation, he wore one of command. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't name, even victory tasted dull. The glasses clinked, the chandeliers shimmered, and yet he felt detached, like an actor forced to repeat the same role in a play that had lost meaning. His life was a cycle of precision, deals, discipline, dominance, and suddenly, that cycle felt unbearably hollow. He was about to leave when he saw her. Near the far end of the ballroom, where the light dimmed into a golden haze, a woman stood arranging flowers on a crystal stand. She was clearly not part of the crowd. Her dress was simple, pale lavender, modest yet graceful. Her hair, soft brown and unstyled, framed a face that seemed unbothered by the noise around her. She worked quietly, slipping petals into place as though tending to something sacred. And when she looked up, her eyes met his across the room, steady, warm, and startlingly pure. For one suspended moment, the entire ballroom seemed to fade into silence. Luca felt something he hadn't felt in years, curiosity without calculation. The woman didn't recognize him. That was clear. She didn't flinch at his gaze or whisper his name to her friend in awe. She looked at him as if he were just a man standing in a room, nothing more. That alone disarmed him. For someone used to being feared, being seen without fear felt dangerously intoxicating. He crossed the ballroom slowly, his footsteps quiet against the marble floor. People moved aside instinctively, not from respect but from habit. Power had a scent, and his lingered wherever he went. When he reached her, she had just finished adjusting a vase of lilies and was wiping her hands on a small cloth. She looked up, surprised but unafraid. "This party feels too loud for people pretending to care," he said, his voice low, more observation than flirtation. She smiled, the kind of smile that was neither rehearsed nor nervous, just honest. "Maybe they think if they speak louder it'll sound like compassion." He almost laughed. "You don't seem like someone who belongs to this crowd." "I don't," she admitted easily. "I work for the event company. The florist got sick, so they called me last minute. I'm more comfortable with soil than champagne." "Then the room owes you its only beauty," he said quietly. She blushed slightly but didn't look away. Flattery sounds different when it comes from someone who doesn't need to try. The simplicity of her words struck him harder than any compliment ever had. He extended a hand. "Luca." "Elena," she replied, her hand light but firm in his. "Elena Hayes." They stood there for a few seconds that felt oddly suspended in time. Around them the orchestra swelled, conversations fluttered, cameras flashed, yet they seemed to exist outside it all. It wasn't attraction in the ordinary sense. It was recognition, as if two very different lives had accidentally touched and realized they shared the same loneliness. When she turned back to gather her things, he surprised himself by asking, "Do you ever wonder what happens if you just walk away from all this?" She tilted her head slightly. "All this?" "The noise, the power, the pretending." She paused, then smiled softly. "Then maybe you'd finally hear yourself think." That sentence stayed with him. It sank beneath his armor and settled somewhere close to where his humanity still hid. He found himself walking beside her as she carried a small box of leftover stems toward the exit. Outside, the night air was cool, scented faintly with rain and asphalt. For a man surrounded by guards, wealth, and constant watchfulness, standing on a quiet sidewalk with a stranger felt almost revolutionary. "You don't have to walk me," she said gently. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." They walked a few blocks in silence. She spoke of her flower shop in Brooklyn, a small place she'd inherited from her grandmother. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She described mornings filled with the scent of roses and coffee, afternoons spent arranging bouquets for people she'd never meet, evenings when the city outside her window looked like a painting that refused to dry. And as she talked, Luca listened, really listened, something he rarely did. Her voice carried a calmness he'd forgotten existed. When they reached her apartment building, a narrow brick structure with ivy crawling up its sides, she turned to him. "Thank you for walking me. Most people don't bother." He nodded, unsure what to say. He wanted to tell her that she had no idea how rare it was for him to care whether someone felt safe. But he only said, "You're welcome." Before she went inside, she hesitated. "I don't know who you really are, but you seem like someone who's tired of carrying too much. Flowers help with that, you know." He smiled faintly. "I'll keep that in mind." When the door closed behind her, Luca stood there for a long time. The city continued its endless pulse around him. Sirens, laughter, engines, lights. But for the first time in years, the noise didn't fill him. It only reminded him of how quiet he suddenly felt inside. That night, as his car drove back through the rain-slicked streets, he looked out the window and caught his own reflection. A man who had everything and yet had just realized what empty truly meant. In his penthouse, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and didn't drink it. He sat by the window, staring at the city that had bent itself to his will, and thought about a florist who preferred petals to diamonds. He told himself he'd forget her by morning. He didn't. When dawn came, he found himself tracing her name in the condensation on the glass. Elena Hayes, a name soft enough to haunt him. He had spent a lifetime building walls high enough that no one could reach him. But now, in a single evening, someone had found the one crack in his fortress. Not with force, but with gentleness. That morning, while the city woke to another day of chaos, Luca did something completely out of character. He took his phone, opened his schedule, and canceled every meeting. He told his assistant he needed a personal day. And as the sun climbed higher, he stepped out into the streets again, not as a king hunting enemies, but as a man chasing something he couldn't explain. He didn't yet know it, but that night had already rewritten the story of his life. The man who commanded the underworld had met the one soul pure enough to remind him that even the darkest hearts can still hear the whisper of redemption. The man who forgot how to breathe, the Yao. Morning sun spilled through the tall glass windows of Luca Moretti's penthouse like liquid gold, washing over marble floors and quiet opulence. Normally, mornings here were disciplined, timed to the second. His assistant arriving at 6, calls at 7, negotiations beginning by 8. But today the silence felt heavier, almost alive, pressing against him as though the entire city outside waited for him to move, and yet didn't dare interrupt his stillness. The world that used to respond to his every word now felt distant, unimportant, almost unreal. He sat in his study, surrounded by order, mahogany shelves lined with rare books, a grand piano he never played, and on the far wall, an abstract painting that cost more than most people's homes. Everything about the room spoke of success, precision, and isolation. And yet amid all that perfection, something felt missing. He couldn't shake the echo of Elena's voice, soft but resolute, reminding him that sometimes you had to walk away from the noise to hear yourself think. That line had followed him through the night, past the city lights, into dreams that refused to let him rest. He had faced rivals, betrayal, and even death threats without losing composure, yet now he found himself pacing like a restless boy. He didn't know why he felt the need to see her again. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe something deeper, something he refused to name. The thought of her small flower shop nestled somewhere in Brooklyn felt like a world away from the towering empire he ruled, a world untouched by ambition, uncorrupted by wealth, a world he no longer knew how to enter. By noon, he made up his mind. Without informing his bodyguards, he took the elevator down, blending into the city like a shadow escaping its cage. For the first time in years, he walked, Not to inspect, not to control, but simply to move without purpose. The city was unkind to those who stopped, but Luca didn't care. He crossed bridges, wandered through markets, and followed the scent of coffee and rain until he found himself standing in front of a narrow shop with ivy crawling up the window frame. The small wooden sign above the door read, "Elena's Garden." The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of roses, jasmine, and something faintly earthy. The smell of life itself. Buckets of flowers lined the walls, their colors melting into one another like a painted sunrise. In the middle of it all, she stood with her hair tied loosely, wearing a faded apron and humming softly as she arranged tulips. It wasn't until she looked up that she froze for a brief moment in surprise, then smiled, that same calm, genuine smile that had burned itself into his memory. "You again," she said, setting down her scissors. "I didn't expect the man in the black suit to remember a florist." "I didn't expect to," he admitted. "And yet here I am." Her eyes studied him quietly. "You look like someone who isn't used to showing up without a reason." He gave a faint smirk. "Maybe I'm trying to learn how to." For a moment they simply stood there, the silence comfortable rather than awkward. The city's noise faded beyond the glass door, replaced by the slow rhythm of her world, the soft rustle of leaves, the muted hum of a radio in the corner, the faint ticking of a clock shaped like a daisy. Time here felt different, like it had learned to breathe instead of run. She offered him a small potted plant. "Most people come here for roses or lilies, but I think this one suits you better." He looked at it, puzzled. "A fern? It's quiet, resilient, survives in the shade. Doesn't demand attention but never dies easily." He stared at her for a moment, caught off guard by how easily she had seen through him. "That's quite a compliment," he said finally. "It's an observation," she replied. "Sometimes the strongest things aren't loud. They just keep growing even when no one notices." He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words settle inside him. He bought the plant, though she tried to refuse payment, and stood there longer than necessary, pretending to browse while trying to understand the strange calm she carried. He'd spent his whole life commanding people, and yet around her he felt no need to. She didn't bow to his presence. She simply existed beside it, equal and unshaken. When he finally left, she handed him a small card. "That plant doesn't like too much sunlight. Water it every few days. Don't overdo it. Some things need space to grow." He smiled faintly. "You talk about plants the way philosophers talk about life." "Maybe they're the same thing," she said. And before he could reply, another customer entered, breaking the spell. Back in his car, Luca placed the small fern on the seat beside him as though it were something fragile. It seemed absurd. The great Luca Moretti, a man who once crushed corporate empires with a glance, now driving through Manhattan with a potted plant buckled beside him. But it made him feel lighter, and when he reached his penthouse, he placed it on the edge of his desk where the sunlight touched gently through the glass. That night, instead of his usual scotch, he poured himself tea, something he hadn't done since his mother died. Days turned into weeks, and he found excuses to visit Elena's shop again. Sometimes he'd claim he was buying flowers for his office, other times for a client event. She never pressed him, never treated him like anyone special. She told him stories about the people who came to her shop, the old woman who bought daisies for her late husband every Friday, the shy boy who sent roses to a girl who never noticed him, the homeless man she gave leftovers to just so he'd have something beautiful to sell for food. Her kindness wasn't loud or performative. It was woven into her every movement, effortless and sincere. In return, Luca found himself talking, truly talking, for the first time in years. About the noise of power, the weight of expectations, the exhaustion of being admired for all the wrong reasons. He didn't know why he opened up, but she never judged. She just listened, her eyes steady, her presence grounding. One afternoon, when a sudden rainstorm hit, he helped her pull the flower stands inside. They laughed when the wind sent petals swirling through the air like confetti, and when their hands brushed against each other, time seemed to pause again. He looked at her, hair damp, cheeks flushed from the cold, and realized he hadn't smiled like this since he was a boy. Later that evening, she brewed him coffee in a chipped mug and handed it over without ceremony. "You look less like a man who rules the city," she said softly, "and more like someone who finally found where he belongs." He wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that his world and hers could never mix, that he was made of concrete and she of sunlight, but the words refused to come. Instead, he said quietly, "Maybe I'm just learning what peace looks like." That night, when he returned home, the city lights seemed softer. His penthouse no longer felt like a fortress, but a shell. The fern on his desk had grown a new leaf, small and tender, reaching for the light. For reasons he didn't understand, that sight filled him with something close to hope. He sat by the window for hours, thinking about Elena, her laugh, her warmth, her strange power to make him forget who he was supposed to be. But peace was a fragile thing, especially for men who built their thrones on chaos. Luca's empire ran deep. Allies who were enemies in disguise, partners who smiled while holding knives, secrets buried under layers of money and silence. And in that shadowed world, change was not welcome. Word began to spread that the untouchable Moretti had been distracted lately, skipping meetings, appearing in ordinary places, spending time with an unknown woman. In his world, weakness, even the illusion of it, invited danger. One night, his oldest confidant, a man named Victor Hale, came to see him. Victor was not a man easily unsettled, but that evening he seemed tense. "Luca," he began carefully, "you know I've stood beside you for years, but the board is getting nervous. They're saying you've changed." "Have I?" Luca asked calmly. "You're softer. You've been missing calls, ignoring deals. You're making people wonder if you still want the throne you built." Luca turned away from the window, his voice low but firm. "Let them wonder." Victor hesitated. "You know they don't just wonder, they move. And they've started moving." That night, long after Victor left, Luca stood alone in the dark, the city lights flickering like warnings in the distance. He thought of Elena, her small shop, her gentle smile, and for the first time fear crept into his heart. Not for himself, but for her. He knew what his enemies were capable of. He knew how easily they could turn anything pure into leverage. And as the night deepened, he realized something he'd been avoiding since the moment he met her. She had become his only weakness. And in his world, weaknesses bled. He picked up his phone more than once, meaning to call her, to tell her everything, to ask her to leave the city for her safety. But he couldn't. How could he explain that loving him could destroy her? How could he take away the one piece of peace he had found? When dawn arrived, the decision was made. He would protect her the only way he knew how, and by staying away, even if it tore him apart. And so, the man who once commanded the city with an iron will stood at his window, watching the first rays of sunlight fall over the skyline. His reflection stared back at him, powerful, composed, and utterly hollow. The fern behind him swayed slightly in the morning breeze from the open window, unaware that the man who had kept it alive had just decided to let go of the only thing that had made him feel human again. The city outside never noticed. But for Luca Moretti, that morning marked the beginning of a storm far more dangerous than any he had ever faced. The kind that doesn't come from enemies, but from the heart itself. The distance between power and peace. 3 weeks passed since the morning Luca decided to stay away from her, and yet every single day since felt like a hollow echo of the last. The penthouse, once filled with the rhythm of his precise routine, now felt like a museum of silence. The coffee on his desk grew cold, meetings blurred together, and even the skyline that once inspired him now seemed like a wall he couldn't climb. He had convinced himself that distance was protection, that by staying away from Elena, he was sparing her from the danger his shadow carried. But the lie began to eat at him, quietly at first, then fiercely until the ache became unbearable. He tried drowning it in work. He threw himself back into his empire, a whirlwind of contracts, acquisitions, and numbers that once made him feel invincible. His office returned to its usual intensity, assistants rushing with reports, phones ringing, voices sharp with strategy. Yet none of it mattered. Even as he signed million-dollar deals, his mind drifted to a small shop in Brooklyn, filled with flowers and laughter. Sometimes he caught himself imagining her hands covered in soil, her smile blooming like morning light. He hated how much he missed her, not because it made him weak, but because it made him real. One late evening, while the city burned in gold and violet hues, Victor walked into his office unannounced. The older man looked uneasy, his voice lower than usual. "You've been quiet, Luca, too quiet. I've known you long enough to recognize when something's wrong. Luca didn't look up from the file in front of him. Quiet doesn't mean broken. It does when silence is your only defense, Victor replied gently. Whoever she is, she's not your enemy. But the people watching you, they will make her one. That made Luca look up, his gaze sharp. What did you hear? Victor hesitated, then slid a small folder across the desk. Inside were photos, blurred, taken from a distance. Elena walking home from her shop. Elena talking to a delivery man. Elena laughing with a child on the street corner. Luca's hand clenched so hard the paper crumpled. They've been following her for a week, Victor said quietly. One of the board members hired men from the old syndicate. They want leverage. You've been distracted and they think she's the reason. For a long moment the world seemed to freeze around him. Luca's mind turned cold. The same coldness that had once made him feared. But now it wasn't rage for power. It was fear for her safety. The woman who had done nothing but show him peace had become a target simply because he cared. He stood up slowly, his jaw tight, voice barely controlled. Get me everything you have on them, names, addresses, I don't care what it costs. Victor nodded. Luca, if you go down this road, you'll start a war. Luca's eyes hardened. Then I'll end it before it reaches her door. That night he returned home, but not to rest. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, not to drink, but to remember who he used to be. The man who didn't hesitate. The man who controlled every outcome. For years he had used fear as armor, but now the thought of losing Elena stripped that armor away. He walked to his desk, where the small fern she'd given him still grew, its leaves delicate but unbroken. He touched one leaf gently and whispered, I tried to protect you by disappearing, but I only made you vulnerable. The next morning, before the city fully woke, Luca drove to Brooklyn. He didn't call ahead, didn't plan what to say. He just needed to see her to make sure she was safe. When he arrived, the shop was just opening. She stood outside arranging a display of chrysanthemums, her hair tied back loosely, sunlight catching in the strands. For a brief moment, he simply watched, the ordinary magic of her presence grounding him more than anything in his empire ever had. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise, followed by something gentler, understanding. I was starting to think you'd vanished, she said softly. I tried to, he admitted. Didn't work. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Why? Because every day I didn't see you felt like forgetting how to breathe. For a long second, she said nothing. The world seemed to narrow until it was just the two of them and the quiet hum of the street. Finally, she whispered, Then maybe stop holding your breath. The simplicity of her words disarmed him again. He wanted to tell her everything, about the threats, the men watching her, the danger he'd brought by caring. But when he looked at her, he couldn't. How could he destroy that calm? Instead, he helped her set up the morning display, their hands brushing occasionally, the small contact burning with unspoken emotion. They worked in silence for a while until she said, You look tired, Luca, like someone fighting too many invisible wars. He looked down, his voice quiet. Maybe I am. And maybe you don't have to fight them alone, she replied softly. Those words struck something deep in him, something fragile and buried. All his life, he had fought alone because he believed no one could understand the weight he carried. Yet here was a woman who offered him help without even knowing what monsters lived in his shadow. He spent the rest of the morning there, pretending it was just another day. They talked about small things, the weather, the music playing on the radio, the strange comfort of routine. It felt almost normal, almost safe. But underneath the calm, danger was moving closer. That evening, as Elena closed the shop, Luca insisted on walking her home. The streets were quiet, the sky turning deep indigo. When they reached her building, he paused at the steps. Elena, he said, his voice heavier than he meant it to be, if I ever seem distant again, it's not because I don't care. It's because I care too much. She studied him for a long moment. Then promise me one thing. Don't disappear without saying goodbye. People deserve that much honesty. He nodded slowly. I promise. When she went inside, Luca waited a few moments before turning away. He walked to the corner where a black sedan was parked under a flickering streetlight. Inside, two men sat pretending to read newspapers. Luca approached quietly, his presence enough to make their hands tremble. Tell your employers, he said coldly, leaning down to the window. If they ever come near her again, there won't be a place in this city they can hide. The driver swallowed hard and nodded. Luca straightened, his expression unreadable, then walked away into the night. But power, once challenged, never retreats quietly. Over the next few days, the threats grew darker. Anonymous messages, broken security feeds, a bullet casing left on the hood of his car, a silent warning. Luca knew what it meant. They were no longer bluffing. One night, as thunder rolled over the city, he received a call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost polite. "You should have learned, Moretti. Every king who falls does so because of the heart he tries to hide." Luca's blood ran cold. He didn't wait for more. He grabbed his coat and gun and was out the door before logic could intervene. Rain slashed across the windshield as he drove through the city like a storm given shape. Every thought in his mind narrowed to one, Elena. When he reached her street, the lights in her shop were still on. Relief hit him first and then fear. The door was slightly ajar. He stepped inside, the scent of flowers mixing with the faint metallic tang of rain. "Elena?" he called softly, his voice echoing in the dark. From the back room she appeared, unharmed though startled. "Luca, what's going on?" He crossed the room quickly, his relief almost overwhelming. "You're safe," he breathed. "Thank God." Her eyes searched his face. "Why wouldn't I be?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "It's nothing, just a bad night." But as he turned to leave, he saw it. A small shadow moved near the back door, a glint of metal under the dim light. Without thinking, he pulled her behind him just as a bullet shattered the glass vase beside them. Chaos erupted. He fired once, then twice until the figure fled into the rain. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena clung to his arm, trembling. "What just happened?" He looked at her, guilt flooding his eyes. "Everything I was trying to protect you from." Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance. He turned to her, his voice low but fierce. "You have to leave the city, Elena, tonight. I'll make sure you're safe." Her eyes filled with tears. "And what about you?" "I'll handle this. It's what I do." "No," she whispered, gripping his hand. "It's what you used to do. But you're not that man anymore, are you?" He looked at her, really looked. And for a moment, the ruthless, untouchable Luca Moretti was gone. All that remained was a man standing in a room full of broken glass torn between love and survival. "I don't know who I am anymore," he confessed. She took a shaky breath. "Then maybe it's time you find out, not as a king, not as a fighter, but as a man." Outside, the rain intensified, washing over the city like a baptism. And as Luca stood there holding the woman who had unknowingly changed everything, he realized that no empire, no throne, no victory had ever felt as terrifying or as sacred as the moment he realized he could lose her. The night wasn't over. It had only just begun. And somewhere in the darkness, the war for his soul had finally started. The truth behind the silence. For days after her stunning revelation in the courtroom, the story spread like wildfire. Every news outlet, every social media platform, every whisper in the town spoke of the nanny who had humbled a millionaire with her truth. Yet behind the glory and the headlines, Clara sat quietly in her small apartment, staring out the window as the city lights flickered. She wasn't seeking fame. She wasn't basking in victory. All she wanted was peace. A peace she had been denied for years while working under a man who saw people as tools and loyalty as something that could be bought. Deep down, she knew that the public only saw the surface of what had happened. They didn't know the hidden story, the one that went beyond humiliation or pride, the one that revealed how broken both of their lives truly were. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived at her doorstep with a familiar signature, Mr. Donovan's. Her heart skipped, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside, there was no anger, no arrogance, only a letter written in shaky, almost unrecognizable handwriting. "Clara," it began, "you were right. I was blind. I thought success was built on power, on control, on keeping people beneath me so I would never fall. But when you spoke in that courtroom, when I saw how deeply I had hurt someone who once cared for my children like her own, I realized something had gone terribly wrong inside me. My empire is crumbling, my family has turned distant, and I finally understand what it feels like to be truly poor. Poor not in money, but in soul." She read the words over and over, a quiet tear sliding down her cheek. For the first time, she saw not the monster who had humiliated her, but a man finally stripped of his pride, forced to face his reflection. Days later, Mr. Donovan reached out again, not to apologize, but to ask for her help. The irony wasn't lost on her. His company had fallen into chaos after the scandal. Investors pulled out, partners withdrew, and the employees, those same people he once looked down upon, had lost all faith in him. He told her he wanted to make things right, not for money or image, but because he couldn't bear the weight of what he had become. He needed her insight, her heart, and her understanding of people, the very things he once dismissed as weakness. Clara hesitated, torn between anger and compassion. She could have ignored him, could have watched his empire crumble completely, but that wasn't who she was. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain, but it freed her from carrying its poison. When she finally walked into his grand but eerily quiet mansion again, she was met with a silence that spoke louder than words. The hallways that once echoed with orders and judgment now felt hollow. Mr. Donovan appeared, no longer dressed in his tailored suits, but in a simple shirt, his face tired and aged beyond his years. "Thank you for coming," he said softly, his tone stripped of all arrogance. "I didn't come for you," Clara replied, her voice calm but firm. "I came because I believe every broken story deserves a chance to heal, including yours." Over the next few weeks, she helped him reconnect with his staff, rebuild trust, and repair the damage his pride had caused. It wasn't easy. Many refused to forgive him, but she kept pushing, not for him, but for the people who deserved better. One evening, as they sat in the once grand dining room now filled with silence, he looked at her and said, "You could have destroyed me completely. Why didn't you?" Clara smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting quiet strength. "Because destruction doesn't change people, Mr. Donovan. Compassion does. And sometimes the best way to win is not to fight at all." For the first time in his life, the millionaire who once thought money could buy everything finally understood that true wealth was built not on fortune, but on humanity. And as Clara left his mansion that night, walking down the long, quiet road under the fading city lights, she felt lighter. She had faced her past, seen her oppressor turn into a man seeking redemption, and most of all, she had proven that dignity, no matter how deeply buried, could never be taken away. It could only be reclaimed. Redemption at dawn. Months passed after that night, and the transformation in both Clara and Mr. Donovan was nothing short of profound. The man who once barked orders from behind a marble desk now arrived early every morning, dressed simply, often the first to greet his employees. The mansion that once echoed with cold silence was now filled with laughter again. His children had returned, tentatively at first, still wounded by the years of neglect, but slowly learning to trust the gentler version of their father. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about rebuilding from the ashes, one act of kindness at a time, and at the heart of it all was Clara, the woman who had once been humiliated, now guiding a broken empire into compassion and humility. The irony of fate was almost poetic. The nanny once dismissed as insignificant had become the voice of reason, the silent architect of a man's redemption. But it wasn't as simple as forgiveness and recovery. Every day came with reminders of the past, the distrust in employees' eyes, the whispers of the media who couldn't let the story go, and the endless pressure of rebuilding a reputation built not on power but on sincerity. Mr. Donovan, who had once thrived under the spotlight, now avoided it entirely. He spent his days listening, learning, and for the first time in years truly seeing people. Clara noticed the change in his eyes. The arrogance had faded, replaced by a quiet awareness, an understanding that life's true worth was not measured in profits but in hearts touched and lives changed. Yet deep inside her, Clara carried her own conflict. She was proud of how far things had come, but part of her still remembered the sting of humiliation, the nights she cried in silence, the years she had spent thinking she was invisible. Forgiving was one thing, forgetting was another. One morning, as the sun broke through the office windows, painting the room in soft gold, Mr. Donovan stood before his employees to speak. It wasn't a grand meeting, no cameras, no press, just him, his staff, and Clara standing quietly at the back. "For years," he began, "I thought leadership meant control. I believed I was building an empire when in truth I was building walls around myself. I failed not only as a leader but as a human being. Many of you suffered because of my pride. And yet one person reminded me what I had lost, the courage to care. Clara showed me that strength isn't about domination. It's about compassion, resilience, and grace under humiliation. He paused, his voice breaking slightly, and looked toward her. I humiliated her once in front of all of you. Today I stand before you to honor her. If not for her, none of this, none of us would still stand. A heavy silence filled the room, followed by something unexpected, applause. It wasn't forced or polite. It was genuine, born of relief and shared humanity. Clara stood still, overwhelmed by the sound, by the sight of the very people who had once looked at her with pity, now seeing her as something more. She hadn't wanted recognition, yet at that moment, she understood something vital. Sometimes, standing up for yourself not only changes your life, it changes everyone around you. Later that evening, as they both stood outside the building watching the sunset, Mr. Donovan turned to her. You've done more for me and this company than I could ever repay, he said quietly. What will you do now? Clara looked at the horizon, her eyes soft but firm. I've spent years fixing other people's lives, she said. It's time I start building my own. He nodded slowly, understanding. For once, he didn't try to stop her, didn't try to convince her to stay. Redemption wasn't about clinging to the person who saved you. It was about learning to walk on your own again. When she finally left, she didn't take anything from him. No money, no gifts, no promises. What she carried was something far more valuable. Her dignity, her self-worth, and the peace that comes only from surviving the storm and still choosing to love. Months later, she opened her own small daycare center, a place where children from all walks of life could learn, play, and feel safe. She named it Second Chances, and on the wall of her office hung a simple framed quote, handwritten by Mr. Donovan himself. Kindness is the only wealth that multiplies when shared. Years would pass, and people would still tell the story of the millionaire and the nanny, the story of how arrogance met humility, how cruelty met compassion, and how two broken souls, in their own ways, found healing. And somewhere on quiet mornings when the sun rose over her little daycare, Clara would smile and whisper to herself, in the end, I didn't just survive. I taught the world how to begin again.